Hello, I'm Annabelle Gonzalez, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and welcome you to Trade Winds, our virtual event series where we discuss the future of global trade in the era of the pandemic with leading policymakers and experts from across the world. Our audience, which comes now from 96 countries and counting, is also a great part of our program. So thank you very much for being here with us. And please keep coming. Remember that our goal is to reach participants from all WTO 164 members. So this is our first episode of Trade Winds in 2021. And we will discuss today Getting America Back in the Game, a multilateral perspective, a topic that is in the minds of government officials, business leaders, trade experts, and many across the world as President-elect Biden assumes office tomorrow. So to lead our conversation, I am very pleased to welcome back to Trade Winds two of our favorite guests. Let me first introduce Richard Baldwin, who is Professor of International Economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, a part-time visiting research professor at the University of Oxford, former president of the Center for Economic Policy Research, and editor-in-chief of Vox since he founded it. Richard participated in our last episode of Trade Winds in 2020, and it is a real treat to have him back in our inaugural 2021 episode. I am also delighted that Chad Bown, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute and a great colleague, of course, who among other many distinguished occupations is the star, along with Sumaya Keynes, of my favorite trade podcast out there, Trade Talks. So welcome to both of you, and thank you very much for being here with us at Trade Winds. I will turn to Richard and Chad in a moment. For you in the audience, as usual, please get ready to submit your questions using the Q&A button in the platform, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. So as the Biden administration takes office, as I was saying, tomorrow, most countries are looking forward to the restoration of multilateralism and American trade leadership. But it will not be a return to business as usual pre-Trump, business as usual pre-Trump trade policy focused on the negotiation of market opening agreements, at least not in the beginning, where the stated priority is to strengthen domestic competitiveness and workers' conditions to successfully compete in the global economy. But this does not mean either that trade policy will be ignored. It cannot be. First, an active trade and investment agenda is part of rebuilding American leadership in the world and holding together coalitions on broader forms of cooperation, including in the foreign policy and climate policy realms. Second, the Biden team will need to undo the damage caused by the Trump administration in this area, including to United States friends and allies. And third, trade and investment are critical for recovery of the US and the global economy. So in the paper entitled Getting America Back in the Game, a Multilateral Perspective that Richard, Chad, and I co-authored with Jonathan Freed, Andres Sapir, and Tetsuya Watanabe, we suggest how to help get the United States back to support, strengthen, and improve a multilateral trading system that provides good jobs, rising living standards, and prosperity for all. The idea is not for each country to pursue bilateral engagements in an effort to outdo others. We think that this will not work. The plan is for a multilateral pathway to reinvigorate international cooperation based on two pillars: working together and formulating initiatives as trade tracks in the portfolios of foreign policy and climate policy. So let me turn over to Richard now. The Trump administration, significantly weakened multilateralism and global trade cooperation. So as President-elect Biden takes office, should he try to restore cooperation and fix the multilateral trading system? Can he do it? And what kind of constraints would he face? And what is the risk of not doing it early in the administration? So Richard, thank you very much again, and over to you now.
Well, thank you very much. I'm unmuted for once. I'll start out talking unmuted. Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, the rules-based multilateral trading system was wonderful and has since 70 years or so. And Trump broke it. And it can be and should be fixed. It needs to be fixed. I would sort of point out to two things. You mentioned them in passing. First of all, we're going to need multilateral cooperation, including in the trade sphere, to fight the pandemic, in particular, distribute vaccines in a reasonable way. And also, there's issues of intellectual property rights concerned with that. But the other is to fight the global recession. That keeping trade cooperation open is important for fighting the recession. So yes, he should try and restore it, and it is going to be difficult. Basically the environment in Washington, and you know this better than me, but it's obvious everywhere, that the environment is deeply changed compared to what it was in the Obama second administration. And trade has become a very difficult topic in the United States. And when Trump was talking in these crude nationalistic terms about trade, there was lots of people who found a resonance in that. So I think this poses real constraints on the Biden administration, and things we have heard him say on the the campaign trail. And I think that it's worthwhile for trade policy people who we tend to think that trade is the most important thing, and these other things are the side events. But these constraints on Biden are deep and real, and they basically come from 2-3 decades of wage stagnation for middle Americans, which has been very, very difficult. And if you read the economics literature, you know this is partly due to automation, partly due to globalization, a lot of it due to automation. But since it's so much easier to blame globalization, foreigners, than it is to blame robots, trade has really been held accountable for a lot of the problem. And that kind of lack of the systematic lack of a safety net to help people adjust has put the Biden administration in a situation where opening up trade further without those nets is really causing a problem for a lot of people. So that probably isn't the way forward, further trade liberalization. Now, the thing is that there are other ways forward, and that's what we're going to talk about. So trade liberalization, the trade agenda has typically, just because it's so easy to do, you start signing free trade agreements, negotiating free trade agreements, and you get wins and you open up markets, and that's the sort of way it's done. But that one probably is a constraint that he's not going to be able to face. And I think it's possible to do. And what I was very encouraged is that his USTR appointee, Catherine Tay, I think is kind of a perfect person to knit together what you might call a more human-centric trade policy, where the goal isn't simply to expand exports and liberalize markets, but rather help foster an environment where there's good jobs for Americans, and there's the wins and loses, gains and pains of trade are shared more widely. So I think I'll leave it at that. Basically, yes, he should do it. Yes, he can do it, but it's going to be a little trickier than simply in the past.
All right, thank you very much, Richard. Chad, you have written extensively about how the America alone approach adopted by the Trump administration on trade policy has not worked, and in particular, on how ineffective it has been in addressing U.S. concerns with China. How should the incoming administration think about repairing alliances in the trade field? And what about you as U.S. allies and friends? Should they approach the U.S. bilaterally to try to fix their own issues first? Or should they try to work more broadly to restore trust, build coalitions, and revitalize multilateralism?
So thanks from me as well for the invitation to be here with you. It's a great pleasure. I think this is the key problem. There's a number of frictions, disputes, fights that the Trump administration either started or facilitated over the course of the last 4 years, that there just seems to be a lot that needs to get done and a lot of decks that need to be cleared. before you can possibly go to the question of kind of working with allies and addressing the maybe common concerns that you have with China, these really, really big issues. And so here I'm thinking about, what they did with the appellate body, the national security tariffs on steel and aluminum, the rancor with which they renegotiated the NAFTA agreement with Canada and Mexico, tariffs on Europe, tariffs on Japan, South Korea, et cetera. So you have all of these countries out there that now have lots of grievances, and that's not even including the Boeing Airbus and the ongoing battles with Europe and concerns with digital services tax. So you've got all these countries that have their own individual grievances, and they're going to come forward and say, look, we want our thing dealt with first, and let's deal with that because we have political pressure at home. I think, yes, you can totally understand that. And I think the Biden administration probably is sympathetic to it and ultimately wants to get there with everybody and to try to figure out a way to resolve each of these issues. But I think doing so from day one is going to be hard because as we know, from the trade world, any policy change that you would make on trade is going to generate some winners, but also some losers. And so even if you're talking about things like, removing the steel and aluminum tariffs, yes, there's efficiency benefits. There's a lot more people in the United States that work in steel consuming or aluminum consuming industries that would benefit from having the reductions or the removal of those tariffs. But we've already seen letters from the steel industry executives and the union saying, please don't remove the tariffs. And so there's going to be some economic costs there and certainly political costs. So I think it's going to take time for the Biden team to figure out how to potentially unwind, if they want to, each of these policies. And so I think trading partners are going to need to be patient and sort of recognize that eventually probably that we will ultimately get there. But I don't think these things are going to be necessarily day one. Hopefully more likely are the willingness to engage on things like the nominee for Director General of the WTO to kind of acknowledge that process and get it moving forward. And then I think, and I'm here along with Richard as well, to move to the other areas where it does seem like the Biden administration is going to be prioritizing. And here, and maybe we can get into some of the details of this, it is going to be the areas of foreign policy, on public health, yes, fighting the recession, but then also on climate. And there, I think the Biden administration getting back into the Paris Climate Accord, thinking about how trade policy might be complementary to each of these areas, I think is important. And I guess the one thing that I'll conclude on, and this was kind of a surprising experience from me during my short stint in government, was to see the very important role that trade policy and the USTR office played in the internal decision-making, the domestic policy-making process in the United States. As domestic policy is getting worked out. And so here we're talking about whether it's pandemic response, fighting the recession, what have you. There's a big role for trade negotiators or trade experts to play to try to make sure that it's done so in sort of a WTO consistent way, that it keeps trade lanes open, that it can be supportive, or that trade can play a supportive role in that as well. And so I think in the immediate term, at least, that's how we should be thinking about the role that trade is going to play in the upcoming Biden administration. It's exactly as Richard said. There are not going to be new trade agreements out there, but it can definitely be an agenda that is engaged in a trade supporting way.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chad, as well. So, Richard, what is the plan? So I think both you and Chad, and I think it's a point that we make in the paper, which is it's important to be pragmatic and look at, what are some potential ways to support the U.S. coming back to the multilateral trading system. So in your view, how could countries who would want to reignite global cooperation on trade help the U.S. Back to support, to strengthen and to improve the multilateral trading system?
So let me take that from two angles. First of all, let's think about what's possible in the Biden administration, and then let's think about how it's best to organize as kind of an international discussion. So we've heard it already a couple times in this podcast that there's this kind of disconnect between a reluctance on international economic cooperation if it involves anything to do with trade liberalization, great reluctance, but a very forward-leaning agenda on foreign policy and climate. Climate and restoring America's role of leadership, moral leadership, military leadership, economic leadership in the world is Oval Office attention stuff right now. And so is climate. Trade, not so much. So when we all sat down and started thinking, how is this going to work? It seems like there's an opening there, that the window is to make trade a track on foreign policy and trade a track on climate policy, not pursuing a traditional trade. This is Biden's trade policy. But for example, when you do foreign policy, the damage that Trump has done to the cooperation and trust of the United States on all sorts of issues with his trade policy is something that will have to be addressed before that gets restored. And likewise, there are elements of climate policy that touch on trade, all sorts of them. And so, for example, the environmental agenda in the WTO that's pre-existing, which is pro-climate, that's the sort of thing that could be fit into a Biden climate policy. So that's the basic idea on the Biden side, is you turn it into trade tracks, into foreign policy and climate. Now, on the other side, the multilateral cooperation, I think the worry is that every single country, Canada will come and worry about softwood and steel, and European Union will come about this, and Japan come about that. And it will be kind of a cacophony, which doesn't really get any attention in the United States. Instead, if these countries, a small group of countries, it's hard to say exactly who, could come together and craft things that could be put plausibly into foreign policy packages. For example, the WTO process, the reform, the moving forward, which many countries support, including the United States, has been more or less thrown off track by Trump's behavior and actions. Most importantly, the DG, holding up the appointment of a new DG to get things going. And that's the sort of thing that could be restarted, would be way below the political radar of people who are worried about hurting American workers, but would definitely be part of restoring the trust of American leadership in a foreign policy world. So that's the sort of thing, is if a group of people kind of got together and thought, well, how can we make this all work together? I think that's the way forward. So two elements: work together, a bunch of countries working together, and design mutually advantageous trade tracks that do not involve American trade liberalization. Now, I think the one that Chad picked up, which I thought was very, very tricky, we'll have to talk about a little bit more, is these metal tariffs. It's a big mess all over the world. Lots of people have problems with it, but there is a possibility of a win-win if they're negotiated. But it's definitely much more like this kind of thing that is divisive in the Democratic coalition. So that's a possibility.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. So this idea of working together and the two tracks on climate policy and foreign policy. But there's also, a whole set of other issues. Chad, you mentioned the metal tariffs, but we know there are many other issues out there. How would you prioritize this list of trade issues on which the Biden administration would need to take action sooner or later?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of priorities. I'll get back to steel and metals in a second, because unfortunately, I do feel as though in some sense that is going to be a priority. But I do, on the other hand, I do think a huge priority and where there's really big wins just waiting to be had is on public health and the pandemic. And so I think, in the absence of any U.S. engagement, it seems, this trade and health initiative has been put forward at the WTO. And, there's basic language there on, facilitating trade, investment, keeping markets open, trying to make sure that countries don't do export restrictions. And if they do, they're temporary and measured and et cetera. But I think we are learning from how the vaccine rollout is working that we actually need to go way bigger than that, right? We're just seeing how it's not working in rich countries. And so we're orders of magnitude below the sort of the resources that we need to be throwing at this problem globally and helping to develop solutions to this. And trade has to be a solution to this. It's going to be absolutely infeasible for every country in the world to be able to develop and manufacture and sell their vaccines. It's going to have to be through trade that this ultimately happens, whether it's on the export side or for the manufacturing countries, being able to import all the ingredients they need, the glass vials they need. Trade is a huge, huge part of the solution to ending the pandemic. And so having, the group of countries and using the WTO as a forum to facilitate that seems to me to be an absolute no-brainer, to both facilitate the multilateral cooperation or even the small group cooperation, since there's really only a handful of countries that are really engaged in the manufacturing and export of the vaccines, and actually furthering the public health objectives here. So I think that would be priority number one, is engaging the United States in that process that already have other countries have taken the lead. Now, on the more negative side, unfortunately, I do see the need to kind of deal with a problem like steel and aluminum and the tariffs for the following reason. There's disputes out there, right? So these have been challenged at the WTO. And while dispute settlement is dysfunctional in general, we do still have the first page panel process. And we really don't want the WTO having to rule on whether what a country did by imposing tariffs was or was not against their national security interests. This is a lose-lose dispute for the WTO. So we need to resolve this dispute before we get a panel ruling here, to not put the WTO in the position of having to make the ruling, because either way they're going to lose, right? So if they say that, oh, okay, the Trump administration, it was okay for you to impose those tariffs, it opens up a giant loophole for any country to basically do the same thing whenever they see fit. If it rules against the United States, we have other populists here in America waiting in the wings, that are very anti-WTO, that are just going to use this as an opportunity to say, look, you've got these bureaucrats in Geneva telling what the United States can and can't do that's within its national security interests. That dispute is in the pipeline, and we're waiting on a panel ruling sometime soon. So unfortunately, I think that is one that the Biden administration is going to have to engage on sooner rather than later.
Yeah, as part of if you wish, restoring the multilateralism, correct. So let me get a little bit more.
Annabelle, can I jump in there? I just want to stress one thing. There's one thing that Biden can do on day one, which we now know day one is 10 days long, and that's lift the opposition on the appointment of the Director General of the WTO. There is a consensus and a process that was consensual. The U.S. kept quiet until the very last minute, maybe for strategic, keep the issue off the campaign or whatever. But there's no reason whatsoever the U.S. can't lift that objection and then at least have somebody to start moving that forward. And that I would really stress is something that should happen very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point, and it's something that we here at TradeWinds, and I know Chad as well, have been saying that the process needs to move forward, and Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala appointed as Director General, because we need the leadership in the organization for the organization to step up its game. Now we have a question from our audience here. We have a question from Marina Foltea, who says, do you think the Biden administration will support Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala for the WTO DDG? And one point that I think would be interesting for our audience is say, well, this should be priority one. Is this something really difficult to do, or this is something that from a pragmatic perspective can happen very quickly? Chad?
I think it could happen very quickly. I have not heard anything. To be fair, the Biden administration, the incoming Biden administration, has been very, very quiet on most of the details of what they foresee their trade policy would be. Right? They have spoken in broad terms about working with allies and multilateral approaches, but they haven't gotten too much into the weeds of any specific topics, sort of recognizing that we do still have a president in charge until January 20th. If you haven't already, Ambassador Lighthizer gave an interview with Amy Williams of the Financial Times that was published this morning, in which he articulated a bit more detail about what his objection to Ngozi was, and in his view that he didn't feel as though she had enough trade experience to be fit for the job. I don't personally think that that's a valid perspective. I think she has a huge amount of trade experience, international experience, and dealing with the critical issues that are in front of the WTO right now. But we'll see. I can't speak for, obviously, the Biden administration and know what their priorities. But I agree with Richard. I think that this would be a huge step in the right direction, getting this particular issue resolved quickly.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So maybe Ambassador Lighthizer's time is running up quickly. No? So what are the concessions that we have an anonymous attendee who's asking, what are the concessions that the Biden administration may seek in exchange for the U.S. re-engaging and supporting the WTO? What do you think about that, Richard?
Well, I think the question is misunderstands what WTO cooperation is about. The WTO has been a vehicle for advancing American interests for 70 years. First the GATT, then the WTO. A lot of the WTO language is written to fit American law. So the WTO, along with many of the international organizations, have been one of the ways in which America has defended its interests effectively by forming coalitions. And that is now more important than ever. When Clinton left office, China had 1% of world trade, and the United States had 13%. Now it's about even. The world in which the United States can unilaterally make things has disappeared. We need to work with allies. Moreover, the WTO is really a rules-based system. So it's about setting up rules of fair play. And I don't think the US needs to demand concessions for it. What has happened in the WTO here in Geneva is because the US was so unilateral and not very clear about what they wanted, the US position was not being heard, and things were just not advancing. So I think the question is, how can the US use the WTO to advance its interests? That's the focus we need to have on. It's not a tariff negotiation where you need to get something to give something. It's a win-win, like agreeing on a common speed limit on a street. You know, everybody wins from having one limit. And if you're not at the table when that gets negotiated, it's going to be somebody else's limit. So that it really is about cooperation, not concessions.
That's a great analogy, Richard. Thanks a lot. I think that Chad was pointing out, a positive sort of low-hanging fruit for cooperation in the area of health and trade. But there's also a concern about other issues. So one point that we make in the paper is that one area where it would be a priority to develop the strategy is how to address the U.S. relationship with China, not for delivering results immediately, but actually thinking about a critical issue in U.S. trade policy. So what should be some of the key elements of this strategy, and what role for trade cooperation in this strategy? Let me bring in a question from Charles Levi, who says, how can multilateral trade cooperation succeed if the WTO is unable to negotiate adequate and effective rules to discipline core Chinese unfair trade and investment practices? So bring in this dimension of how to develop a strategy with or without allies in dealing with China. Chad, you want to come in on this one? Yeah.
So this will go a little bit off track from, I think, what the point of our getting the United States back in the game with multilateralism, that is sort of the document that we wrote. But it was very much in the back of our minds, I think, when we were writing it. Even we didn't want to prejudice ourselves against the possibility that the United States might begin to work with other countries on these bigger issues. We don't see this as an immediate win, but it's something obviously that needs to be dealt with over the long term. Now, how do you do it? I think the experience over the last 4 years is that the United States going it alone with China through the trade war and then the phase 1 agreement didn't move the needle. right? We saw a few tiny elements in the phase one agreements on say forced technology transfer and intellectual property, but nothing on industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, any of those kinds of issues. The European Union just went at it alone, right? They just negotiated CAI, the agreement on investment with China. We haven't seen the text yet, but from what I have been told, and shout out, thank you from Annabelle for Trade Talks. We had an interview with the Director General, Sabine Weyand, and she said there's basically not much in there on industrial subsidies and those types of things. The point of all this is nobody can go at it alone with China. If you want to do this, you need to do it with at least a small collection of countries. How to do it? Well, they had started, the United States, EU, Japan, started this trilateral process through which essentially a year ago, right at this time, they had begun to publicize, roll out text on what some new rules on industrial subsidies might be. Now, you then had the pandemic hit, and so that basically got nowhere last year. But I think the need would be to re-engage that process, expand it to some additional like-minded countries that are also concerned, work on further developing the text, what those rules might be, and then eventually bring that to China and see if you can get them to sign up to new rules through perhaps a plurilateral. Now, that being said, that's probably not enough in and of itself, right? How are you going to get China to sign up to new disciplines, new rules that's going to constrain its behavior? Maybe it needs to be a bigger part of a bigger package of items where there's going to be wins there in some context for everyone. But I think that is a way potentially forward when we're talking about multilateralism, getting the Biden administration, the United States back in the game, that you could ultimately see progress. Probably not on day one, probably not on day 30, but hopefully sometime over the course of 2021, might we see some movement in that direction.
Thank you, Chad. Richard, you want to come in?
Yeah, absolutely, thanks. So I agree with that. I mean, I think one thing that's worth pointing out is probably the WTO is the wrong place to talk about an issue as difficult and more or less focused on one or two countries in the world. It's a big place, and it's not where you take up one specific issue. I also agree that it's most likely that it'll involve agreement among a coalition of countries that then invites a discussion with China. And once all that's done, potentially it'll get put into the WTO rules, or maybe not. But that's definitely not where it should be discussed. Now, if you recall, the Obama administration, none of this is new, right? I mean, everybody has a trouble with industrial subsidies from China. It's so successful, it's so big, the largest manufacturing. It's playing by a different set of rules, and it really matters to everybody around the world. Now, the plan under the Obama administration was to go through the Trans-Pacific Partnership to set up some rules about state-owned enterprises and then invite or cajole China to join and therefore respect them. And also, I think China, as it develops, may be less eager to resist this kind of thing. But in any case, the idea was to get a bunch of countries that matter, set rules, and then discuss with China. And I think that's still the right way forward, but CPTPP is done now. So it's probably, joining that's probably not a good way to do it. But this idea of going with the trilateral and discussing and realizing that this is a special issue that will have to be dealt with in some sense outside the room of WTO before it comes back. I think that's the issue. And again, this is part of a foreign policy thing. The whole U.S.-China competition and rivalry, that's part of foreign policy, not just trade policy. And I think putting it all together to make a trade track of the foreign policy with involving China and the U.S. would be kind of a way to make this make sense.
Thank you very much, Richard. I think we have a couple of questions on the U.S.-EU Comprehensive Agreement on Investment related, and how does this relate to this issue of industrial subsidies? But I highly recommend for you to listen to Trade Talks, as Chad was saying. The latest episode talks about this issue, and the next episode of Trade Winds, we will have Sabine with us talking precisely about the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on on investment. So I will park that a little bit on the side. So I just want to come back a little bit to this point on CPTPP, because we have Greg Smith suggesting, can this, can coming back to CPTPP in some way, in some different framework, can this serve U.S. interest? And someone else also asked, an anonymous participant asked, will the fact that RCEP came into being will impact sort of like the thinking in this area? So Richard, you want to come in first on this one?
Sure. So the answer is, I think joining CPTPP is exactly the sort of stuff that Biden administration won't want to do, at least in the first term, because it would involve liberalizing with countries like Vietnam, which are low-wage countries, and it would cause an upset for a lot of people. So I don't think that really is realistically going forward. And once you sort of take the CPTPP off, then you have to start thinking about going in different ways. But CPTPP, I would argue, is not possible in the near term, exactly because it's liberalization with low-wage countries.
Okay, good. So Chad, we've been talking here about priorities in the WTO. We talked about removing the blockage to the Director General, about a health and trade initiative. We have Akmal Mukhtar asking, in your view, which issues or topic would be the top priority for the Biden administration, aside from the ones that we have mentioned?
I think the other big one that they're going to have to engage with, and it's tangentially related to trade through sanctions, is digital services taxes, right? And so perhaps somewhat surprisingly, the Trump administration, even when France has gone ahead and started collecting the revenue, and the United States has the Section 301 report investigation already done and has sort of lined up their retaliation sanctions, said in this one case, we're not actually going to apply them. We've got this OECD process that's been going on for a while. I think, this is an area where the Biden administration might need to engage, relatively quickly to help us actually get to a solution here. Now, this also isn't quick. There's a lot of elements to this. It's not just tax once we talk about the tech space. There's also data issues, privacy issues, regulatory issues. We now have, I think, Department of Justice investigations of both Facebook and Google here in the United States ongoing. So there's a lot of moving parts, but I think, one of the areas that they're probably going to take the Section 301 tariff issue off the table is articulating exactly how it is that they're going to be willing to engage with the world on digital services taxes. And obviously, we have e-commerce at the WTO and those talks and the moratorium on duties there too. So I think that would be an area that you would hope to see them engage in relatively quickly.
Okay, thank you. So we've been talking a little bit about the possibility of putting trade tracks on climate policy, one of the priorities of the Biden administration. So we have two questions from our audience that would like to learn a bit more about this. So from Haynes Schloman, we have, can you elaborate on where you see the win-wins between the climate change and the trade policy re-engagement tracks, presumably the low-hanging fruits at this point? Then we also have a question from Ricardo Melendez Ortiz.
Annabelle froze. So you want to go first, Richard? Talk about climate?
Yeah, so I missed the last part of Ricardo's question because it froze up. But so on climate, I think there's a couple things to start talking about. This is not something for tomorrow. It's not an agreement, but there is a lot of push for including trade sanctions on climate issues, like happened with the Montreal Protocol. Now that is allowed under certain circumstances. They're called border tax adjustments. And that kind of discussion about what would be reasonable, what could be agreed, I think that discussion should start. The second one, which is already ongoing, which is the environmental, there's a negotiation in the WTO on environmental goods. In other words, removing tariffs on goods that will help everybody meet their climate goals, things like solar panels and wind. And that, I think, since America actually is pretty effective at that, there's some things the U.S. imports, some things they export, but it could very much be a win-win. So that's another one that could go forward. And then lastly, intellectual property rights. Some of the technology which is pro-green could be, I mean, eventually used like in drugs, where there was a licensing of kind of generic things to help poor countries afford drugs. And you could imagine something similar to that in the trading system, where there's exceptions to intellectual property rights or special treatment of intellectual property rights. So I think there's a number of ways that they could be interacted, but none of them are for a deal for tomorrow. But there's no doubt that if the climate policies of countries become very different and they treat carbon taxes, for example, very different, there will be an irresistible push to put on adjustments at the border. Just like countries who have different value-added taxes, they want an adjustment at the border for that sort of stuff. If everybody gets carbon taxes, that will be coming. So again, that's not for tomorrow, but it's a discussion that should start. And if it can spin it out a little bit more, I would also say that that's what so much of what we're talking about is let's get back to talking about stuff. Whereas the Trump administration had explicitly destroyed multilateral cooperation on trade issues, including issues where there was absolutely no way that they could fix it by themselves, such as subsidies on steel. It's not or fishing. So I think that's really what we need to do is with these trade tracks, is view it as a way of restoring America's leadership in the world in foreign policy and trade by re-engaging in multilateral discussions, realizing that multilateral negotiations are a way of advancing American interests, but not just American interests, but it's a way of advancing the interests of society as a whole. And in some sense, what I like to say is let's put some light back in the enlightened self-interest that was driving American cooperation on trade, since Republican and Democrat administrations going all the way back to really the Smoot-Hawley Act. Everybody realized that it was a win-win, and we just need to get back to that and start talking. Did we lose Annabelle completely?
No, she's back. Let me, you're muted, Annabelle. We can't hear you. So let me say one other thing and I'll turn it back over to you. So I agree, Richard, with what you just said. I don't think it's short term either, though I think I agree, even the ability to talk and engage. You look at what the European Union is doing, and I think they're very, very eager to move forward on a giant green agenda. Border carbon adjustment mechanism tax could be part of that, but as they're explaining it, that's not how they want it to be viewed, right? They see it as a bigger issue, and so we'll see what the Biden administration's overall approach will be and what their priorities are going to be, and hopefully we'll have patience for this, and it doesn't just devolve into talk about border taxes. But just to show how hard it is, let me kind of point to two issues where the United States does not do well on these things. So first, obviously, is we have had tariffs on solar panels, right? Under safeguard tariffs. Before that, trade remedies, anti-dumping, countervailing duties on solar panel imports for now nearly a decade, right? And so we're not helping facilitate the trade in green goods. And then, the Biden administration, I think, if I read the news correctly over the last day or so, has talked about trying to deal with the XL pipeline. This very, very controversial project of getting oil from Canada has been caught up in ISDS, right? So not trade, but investor-state dispute settlement. And there's now talk in the international investment geekery world, in which we're all sort of tangentially there, about whether the United States is going to face an ISDS dispute over this, right? So clearly, there's a lot of challenging issues in dealing with this that I think that they're going to have to grapple with, but hopefully, I agree with you, engage internationally and talk with other countries, try to pull this stuff out of litigation and to try to put it at a higher level where we can be aspirational and make progress on these things.
Mm. Thank you. Thanks to both of you, and I'm back again. So I think this message of dialogue, discussion, deliberation is a critical one, which we have lost, or the world has lost in the past couple of years. So would it make sense or to bring part of this discussion to the G20? How can the U.S. Deal with the G20 to lead the global economic recovery? Chad?
Sorry, anytime somebody says to me, the United States take a leadership role, I am just flummoxed by having, it's still sort of PTSD of the last 4 years. So I do think the Biden administration needs to do this. So we do need to have a coordinated recovery in terms of, active fiscal policy management and obviously coordination of what central banks will be doing to make sure that we get growth going, because that's sort of what makes the world go. I do think hopefully you would see some engagement on some of these public health issues in the G20 as well. Clearly, even climate is probably the place where that should be re-engaged because that's where all the big emitters are, right? And so getting countries to take on, more aspirational targets in terms of reducing their overall emissions is probably needed there. It's got all of the sort of the major players. The hard part is now, we have to deal with the legacy or the residual of the new tensions that are now there with China. And so this is going to be an inevitable challenge that the Biden administration is going to face. In my view, that has to be managed, obviously, because so many of these challenges that we do face are global. And thinking that you can somehow live in a world where China is over there and the rest of us are over here and we'll figure it out just isn't going to work, because whether we're talking about climate, whether we're talking about public health, these are global public bads, global public goods that have to be dealt with collectively. Mm-hmm. And so I do think the G20, where all of these major players are there, is hopefully, possibly the vehicle in which that could happen. So maybe we'll look to see for an enhanced role for that particular vehicle.
Thank you. So Richard, what do you think about this point of the G20?
Sure, the G20. So I think I want to go at it in two ways. So one, the G20 summit was set up after the last big crisis, which was the global financial crisis. And although it didn't do that much, it provided some certainty. It gave guidance that there was a global agreement on certain things. One of them, for instance, being not to go back to protectionism, to provide some sort of uncertainty, that everybody agrees with that. And that got taken off with the Trump administration. So I think that's certainly one of the things could do. The second way I'd like to go about it is we've been talking, just maybe because this is in Washington a little bit, that it's the U.S. has an issue with China and then it has to solve that. But these countries they're all kind of grown-ups. So people can compete on one part and agree on other parts. And the G20 is a reasonable way in which the US and China can talk about and agree on things where they do agree. But it's probably not the right place to take some of the very narrow issues that are very, very contentious. Lots of countries have the same problem. But basically, it's countries who are major manufacturers, and there aren't that many around the world who have the problems with, say, for example, industrial subsidies, because they don't have big manufacturing. And the G20 has many, many other issues. So I think the G20 is, that will be part, I hope, of Biden's getting back America in the game, where moral leadership, thought leadership, and leadership just in general can be channeled through the G20 to do what it can do. And then these other issues aren't really going to be able to be settled in the G20 because so many people around the table have no skin in the game, so to speak. So that's where I think the G20 has always been a relatively hortatory body, but very, very useful. And Trump destroyed it for that. And I hope Biden can get back to it, but it's not going to cure all the great big trade problems that the US has. It won't solve the interface problem of two forms of capitalism interfacing in trade.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Before we move to a question on the rest of the world, because we've been talking here about the EU and Japan and China industrial subsidies, but I also want to bring in the rest of the world. But before we go there, I got a question a few days ago from Ryan Welsius, who sent it beforehand. So I want to bring it to you as well. And it relates to points that several participants have been making in terms of how can the WTO be more effective? If the US wants to come back to multilateralism, how can the WTO be more effective and deliver? And there's one specific question by Ryan on would it be better for the multilateral deals to be done in more manageable plurilateral settings within the WTO? So a quick comment, please, maybe Chad from you on plurilaterals, please.
So I do think that's a possible way. And I think what we should also remember is that the multilateral system and the WTO was not working swimmingly well before the Trump administration came along, right? We had countries here or there, we can go remain nameless, who effectively did much of what the Trump administration did, in terms of preventing any additional progress at the WTO on issue this or issue that by vetoing things. And so I think what happened with the United States was to, one way to interpret that is to say, well, we can do that kind of thing too, right? And so now everybody should recognize that. Everybody should stop doing that. And if you don't have skin in the game on some particular issue, don't hold up everybody else from pushing forward, and we'll just maybe let these smaller plurilateral groups of countries push forward on some of these really bigger ticket items that you don't need to have 164 members around the table. You do want to make sure that you're doing things and making progress in a way that isn't going to be discriminatory, right? That isn't going to go against their interests. But not everybody needs to be there, I think, to make sure that we actually make some progress so that we keep some of the major key linchpins actively engaged in the multilateral system in ways that, frankly, they've been, I think, fed up over the last 10 or 15 years or so with the lack of any progress whatsoever on some of the key things that they're most worried about. And so, yes, I think plurilaterals are a potential way to push forward in some of these key areas.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So probably a critical change in mindset is required here. It's not only, I think you make a good point, Chad, which is it's not only re-engagement by the U.S., but actually other members also thinking about what way forward for the WTO. So this brings me to another question. We've had a couple of questions, including. Here we have one from Joy Katekagwa, who asked about, what are your thoughts on how the U.S. should engage with Africa, either within the new Africa Continental Free Trade Area agreement or others. But let me bring this also in a broader context, which is, so what about the rest of the world? What can the rest of the world do to help bring the U.S. back to multilateral trade cooperation? Let me maybe start with you, Richard, and this would be your closing remarks, please, as well.
Sure. Well, so the way trade has often gone for a very long time is the big guys agree on things, and then the small guys adapt. And I'm not sure that that's going to change under the Biden administration. I wish it weren't that way, but it's just a commercial reality that size and economic size matters. Now, one more constructive response would be something that Chad mentioned, is that there has been a certain amount of blockage in the WTO, obstructionism in the WTO, sometimes by small countries, and it would be good to realize that has consequences, perhaps in the U.S.'s willingness to take a leadership role. But I would also, really, it seems to me that the way the WTO was making progress before the Trump administration was this, say, trade facilitation agreement model, where there was a common kind of goal, but a differentiated way of getting there. And there was a technical aid tied together with the commitments made. And there was some differentiation between countries. And I think cooperating in that kind of model would be one way of letting smaller countries to engage. The other is to engage in things like the digital trade talks or fishing talks, where it's important that people engage, and that I would just put it into the engagement in the existing processes. Now, the last one is a really, really small country. New Zealand and Singapore have done a number of what they call pilot agreements. In fact, the whole TPP started with 4 small countries who don't trade very much having an idea of how to knit together all the noodle bowl in Asia. So small countries who can create kind of models or focal points by negotiating things, and they can be freer than the big guys. So it has happened where trade initiatives come from small countries.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. Chad, your views?
So what I would say on this is, I think honestly we've been a little stuck over the last couple of years, and notwithstanding Richard's point on the trade facilitation agreement, and part of, I think, one of the reasons we've been stuck is things have kind of been siloed. And so we've been doing the fisheries talks in isolation. We didn't make anywhere on environmental goods, so we gave up that. We didn't make anywhere on TISA, so we gave up that. I think the world has changed sufficiently. There's been a lot more issues that are now out there on the table. We've got these ideas about plurilaterals. This isn't going to happen today, but so much now needs to get fixed. But there may not be wins for everybody within each one of these little issues. So maybe we need to start to think about packaging them together, putting together a couple of plurilaterals, put together fish, TISA, and environmental goods, right? Make sure there's enough wins there for everybody that we actually push this kind of stuff forward. I think we have to remember that everywhere, if you're talking about trade agreements, there's always political baggage that gets associated with having to do whatever you need to do domestically to make these things happen. So we don't want to have to do it a lot. The more that we can kind of put together to get it done once, I would say, sort of like we did in the Tokyo round, right? A collection of plurilateral agreements, rather than this kind of either single undertaking like we did in the Uruguay round, or these small things that we've been doing one-off recently. Maybe that's the way to go to help deal with, over the next couple of years, some of these major sets of issues that we want to have tackled. Put a bunch of them together.
Yeah. I think that's a great suggestion. I would like to add, I think, from to what both Richard and Chad were saying, that I think for the rest of the world, the most important thing at this point would be to be able to revitalize this global trade cooperation. We have seen the challenges of navigating a world where trade cooperation has weakened. So even if a particular country may not be cited in our conversation, it doesn't mean that this country does not have a big stake in having the multilateral system work for solving their own issues and for making progress on some of these other topics that we've mentioned. So at the end of the day, it seems to me that large and small countries all have a big stake in making the multilateral system work. And hopefully, in the ways in which both Chad and Richard have explained today, the US will be able to return to support multilateral trade cooperation. But there's clearly also a very important role to play, I think, for many other countries out there to revitalize this cooperation as well. It does not fall only on the US, although this is a very important participant. So with those words from my side, let me thank very much Richard Baldwin and Chad Bound for a great conversation. I would like to make a special recognition to my colleague, Matt Panisari, who is Peterson's IT manager, who has been instrumental in bringing trade winds to all of you. So thank you very much, Matt, for your help and all the best in your new endeavors. Thanks to our audience for your continued participation. A lot of great questions today. I will make sure to send them to Richard and Chad so that they continue to think about all the great points that you were making. Please make sure to join us in our next episode of Trade Winds on Wednesday, February the 3rd. We will explore the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment with Sabine Weyand, Director at DG Trade in the EU. So until then, again, thank you very much and goodbye.